In 1900, Freud's interpretation of dreams had come out, and he picked it up and flipped through it, and it didn't really interest him. But about 2-3 years later, it interested him very much because he began to develop relationships with his patients. He was studying schizophrenia primarily, and he had developed the word association test. And the word association test is actually the ancestor of the polygraph. It comes right out of this. And what it is basically they would make lists of these words, and they would call them stimulus words, and they would just say the word to the patient, and the patient would say the first word or phrase that comes to mind, and they would go right down the list. And they would write down what the reaction time of the patient was, how long it took them. Very often, they would say black, white, mother, father. But if you say, mother, and you're scratching your head, and you've hit a complex. So Jung began to develop this complex theory that there are these resistances in the psyche. It's a little bit like he was using these words to shoot a kind of X-ray into the psyche to find out where the person's problem areas were. And he called these problem areas complexes. And he says a complex, and this becomes, in my opinion, the ancestor of the theory. The complexes become the archetypes later on. But at this point, he says the complexes are these clusters of associated feelings, images, and attitudes and ideas about a particular, they will center around a particular subject. For example, the parent complex, or the power complex, the erotic complex, the career complex, and so forth. And people, when complexes are hit, get very emotional for sudden, very unaccountable reasons. And it's always, he says, invariably because a complex has been hit. And it has momentarily overtaken control of the ego, which is itself a complex. But it's not always driving. Occasionally the passengers hijack the driver. And in fact, and you can see why he's so respected, because he was a genius. The whole book begins with what he calls the dream of Irma's injection. And I've forgotten most of the details of the dream. But he takes this one dream that he had of this patient, and I wish I could remember it, but he goes through and pulls it apart and shows you every little detail where it has come from in a previous association of his. A patient that he had, a book that he saw, and he's a master at just pulling it apart. And Rick Tarnas pointed out that this is his, he has an exact midpoint between Mercury and Pluto, which is that obsessive intellect, the Sherlock Holmesian fathoming of very obsessive mind. So he's very good at what he does, but it just doesn't go deep enough, because occasionally you'll see he'll tell a dream or something, and then he'll give this extremely artificial interpretation, and it just won't make any sense at all, and you know that something is wrong with the theory. It's not broad enough. And but Jung at this point accepted the repression theory because it made sense out of the results, the experimental results that he and Bleuler were getting out of the word association experiments, that these were complexes that had been repressed. And Freud's theory explained it. But nobody was taking Freud seriously at all at this time. And so when Jung wrote a letter to Freud and sent him his little book on word association experiments in 1906, Freud was very enthusiastic, because here he is getting on his 50s, and nobody knows who the hell he is. And here he gets a letter from this Zurich medical hospital, and all the psychoanalysts that are hanging out with Freud at this time are all Jewish. And he has fears that part of the reason he's not being taken seriously is because people think it's a Jewish thing. And here comes this Aryan, coming out of this Aryan culture complex, and he's just absolutely excited about the political possibilities of having the entire medical establishment of Zurich on his side. So he plays it up, and he's very nice to Jung, and writes back and says, Jung, from the start, though, and if you or look at the Freud-Jung letters, it's very comical. It makes very compelling reading, actually. Jung was very clear from the start. He says, I'm not sure I can follow your sexual theory. I'm just going to say I like the repression aspect and all of that, but I think there are other things at work going on, but I'm going to attribute it to my youth and lack of experience, and we'll leave the door open there. And Freud always writes back and says, I'm sure you'll come along to adjust your attitude and mind. It's just a matter of time. And so they go back and forth, and then about a year after their correspondence begins, 1907, the Jungs go to visit the Freuds. And they meet each other, and they go into Freud's study and close the door, and the wives don't hear from them for 13 hours. So this was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're talking straight till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, during that visit, this came to light much later on. Jung had confided to a psychoanalyst that Freud's was actually involved in a very complex love triangle with his wife and his wife's sister, who was living with them at the time. And the sister actually approached Jung and said, I feel very guilty about my relationship with the doctor. And Jung had already picked up on the fact that Freud had dropped a little comment like, I'm very sorry to accommodate you here, I just have an old woman living with me, referring to his wife. And Freud met her and Jung met her and realized that she knew absolutely nothing about Freud's work or what he was doing or what he was up to, but the sister knew everything. She knew all the details. And she was much younger and very pretty, and Jung had already put it together himself, and she said, I don't know what to do about this, but he's in love with me, and it's a very sticky situation. And so we leave that fact there for the time being. But Freud never knew, according to Jung, that Jung knew about his love triangle with these two women. And it's also worth remarking that the three of them lived together for their entire lives. And I remember someone remarking that visiting Freud, they had to go, in order to get to the bedroom of Freud and his wife, they had to go through the wife's sister's room, and how they found that very odd. And so whatever arrangement they had, it was extremely...
The warden's head, by the way. So are we to assume, since I know Freud, that he was actually like sleeping with both his women, or sleeping with any of them?
From all I know is that and guess is that he was probably sleeping with his wife's sister. I don't know about anyone else at this point, although I've heard things that he may have slept with other women. I kind of tend to doubt it, though.
I do too.
He was very, very guarded, and I think he was very anxious.
Well, at least he got to the young sister. This is actually a benefit.
Yeah. Well, so anything.
Huh? No, because we're all still raised in that. But that he was attracted to a feminine thing that he actually shared with, even though, that's not real common knowledge. That's like almost cheating on himself from the way he presents, that's all.
Right. You'll find that in the Campbell introduction to the book.
Wasn't there some suggestion to that he had a relationship with Emma?
Possibly, I don't know. I haven't actually read a lot of Freud, so. Possibly.
Well, there was always that theory.
There's also a theory that he was repressed homosexuality because of his reactions every time a higher father figure, a male figure than him, is suggested.
Yeah, it's very possible. Yeah. So.
No, we've got a sex life down.
So this is the visit in 1907. Another year goes by, and Freud visits him at the Bergholzi. Jung takes him on a tour through the institution, and everything is going just fine. Then another year passes, and then we get to the crucial year, 1909, which is really the noon of their relationship. From this point on, it's downhill. In 1909, the Jungs go to visit the Freuds again, and this time Jung is talking with him at night in his study, and he decides that he wants to know, for the record, how Freud feels about the occult. He's been very careful not to mention anything at this point, but Freud would have known that he had done his dissertation on the occult. And he said, so what is your feeling about this whole subject? And Freud says, it's ridiculous. And then Jung didn't feel like he could respond the way that he wanted to, and he felt this sudden anger burning within him. And suddenly there was this loud snap. And both men jumped up out of their chairs, and apparently there had been a snap from this huge bookcase that he said we were afraid the thing was going to topple over onto us. And we both stood there, and Jung said, there, you see, that is an example of a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon, whatever that means. And then Freud says, oh, bosh. And Jung says, and not only that, it's going to happen again. Crack! It happens again. And he said, Freud just stared at me aghast. And then we know this happened because in the Freud-Jung letters, Freud's letter trying to rationalize the whole thing is there. It's on record. And he writes back to him after the Jungs return to Zurich. And he says, well, I've been looking at the whole matter, and at first your little demonstration was beginning to convince me, but then I started looking at my bookcase, and I started realizing that how unstable it was, and occasionally it makes these weird creaking sounds at night. And the fact that he would even sit there and rationalize it already tells you that something's upset him. So we know something like this went on.